Alright guys, so in this video I thought it would be a fun idea to take a look back at the September Heisman phenomenon. Yes, it's the idea of a player, whether preseason narrative or early September hype, becomes the Heisman front runner. I mean, a few of these cases legitimately, it seemed like a lot these players were going to win into early October, but these are just 10 different cases. Some of it's just based off of preseason, some of it is into the regular season, beginning with Jeremy Johnson, the Auburn quarterback, the big arm. I remember him being hyped up, specifically his junior year. You can see how that turned out: 10 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. This is more of an example of a preseason Heisman, and you can see via his game log there, Auburn started a neutral site game against Louisville, and he immediately struggled heavily. 11 to 21, 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions. I remember that game against Jacksonville State. They nearly lost that game against Jacksonville State. Yeah, Jeremy Johnson, more of a preseason Heisman, but still a decent example because he always had hype going into the season. Moving on to number 9, it is Denard Robinson, and specifically his 2011 junior campaign. Looking at Denard Robinson's stats, I'm surprised at how many interceptions he threw, but he was always mainly a running quarterback. His junior year, he started kind of a so-so game against Western Michigan. Michigan sleptwalked through that one, but Notre Dame, he goes 11 of 24, but 338 yards, 4 touchdowns. He runs for another 108 yards. And then look at his next 2 weeks rushing. 198 rushing yards against Eastern Michigan, and then 200 rushing yards against San Diego State. Just crazy early season output. He had over 500 rushing yards through 4 weeks as a quarterback. And he also had about 7 touchdowns. Now you can see Michigan losing some games, a lot of interceptions for Robinson, and his overall rushing really dissipated as the season went on. He is another decent example of a September Heisman. Moving on to number 8, it is Khalil Tate. What an amazing name that is, Khalil Tate, for a dual threat college quarterback. But yeah, Khalil Tate, believe it or not, his sophomore season, where he threw 14 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, he was receiving early season Heisman hype completely out of nowhere. You can see the first game, he didn't even start against Northern Arizona. He comes in against Houston, throws an interception, but then on the road at Colorado, this is measured to be one of the greatest quarterback performances in recent college football memory. 12 of 13, 154 yards, 1 touchdown, no interception. So 1 incompletion, 14 carries, 327 rushing yards, averaging 23 yards a carry, and 4 touchdowns. He follows that up with 230 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and then the week after that, 137 rushing yards. And you can see what ends up happening to Arizona that year. They end up losing towards the end. That's always going to eliminate you from being a Heisman candidate. The rushing kind of dissipates, but still had 1,400 rushing yards. Just crazy numbers from Khalil Tate, just coming completely out of nowhere. Moving on to number 7, it is Saquon Barkley. This was his junior year, and going into his junior season, everyone knew Saquon was the best player in college football. It was just a matter, was he going to win the Heisman? And he had a game early in the season on the road at Iowa that he completely took over. He had 211 rushing yards. He had 12 catches for 94 yards. And I remember people giving Saquon Barkley the Heisman after that game. And then that was the same year Penn State destroyed Michigan at home, and Barkley had a really long touchdown run. He had 15 carries for 108 and 2 touchdowns. You can see the week after, though, at Ohio State, completely shut down. That was the game where JT Barrett came back. Saquon Barkley actually returned the opening kickoff for a touchdown, but his stats were not good. 21 carries for 44 yards. And you can see, even against Rutgers, 14 carries for 35 yards, really went down towards the end of the season, ended up with under 1,300 rushing yards on the year, Saquon Barkley. After that Iowa game and after that Michigan game, everyone thought he was going to win the Heisman. Moving on to number 6, it is Michael Penix Jr. this past year. So yeah, he had a crazy start to the season, and Washington ended up having a bunch of games like really late at night towards the end, and he just tailed off. So you can see his start. Look at the passing yards: 450, 409, 473, 304, 300, 300, just constantly over 300, over 400, 5 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns. But then towards the end of the season, against pretty bad opponents, his just overall output tailed off. At Oregon State, he goes for 162. Washington State at home, just 204 passing yards, and the interceptions go up a little bit. He still did have a very nice season, but if he would have at least continued that output, you could definitely make the case. Like, if he finished with 40 passing touchdowns and like 5 interceptions based on team record, he would have won the Heisman over Jaden Daniels, because Daniels lost 3 games and he lost 0 games. But moving on to the next one, it is Tua Tagovailoa. So this was his 2019 season. Obviously, Tua coming off an amazing sophomore campaign, already the favorite to win the Heisman as a junior, or at least one of the favorites. He starts off just crazy. 4 touchdowns, no interceptions, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions, 6 touchdowns, no interceptions. And unfortunately, this is kind of just a forgotten season. Like, that start is ridiculous by Tagovailoa. This was the year that Alabama lost to LSU when it was like the college Super Bowl 2-3 in Tuscaloosa against Joe Burrow, when Joe Burrow just went crazy. That LSU 2019 team was ridiculous. But yeah, kind of a forgotten year for Tua. And Joe Burrow, there was no national dialogue about him winning the Heisman in 2019 until midseason, because in 2018, Burrow, who transferred from Ohio State, he threw like 15 passing touchdowns the entire season. So Tua was the heavy favorite and then tailed off after losing to LSU at home and got injured. Moving on to number 4 in terms of the September Heisman, it is Spencer Rattler. So Spencer Rattler, going into his junior year, it was supposed to be standard procedure for Oklahoma quarterbacks. Lincoln Riley produces Heisman winners. Spencer Rattler was a former 5-star top 10 overall player. He had a good redshirt freshman season, 28 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and everyone thought he would win the Heisman as a junior, and he immediately struggled right out of the gate. Versus Tulane, just 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. He kind of brings it back against Western Carolina, pads his stats a little bit, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions, but it was just a weird, wonky season, and I think people knew right away that Spencer Rattler was not what many of us thought. You know, comparing him to Patrick Mahomes, it was just a weird situation, and he ends up getting benched for true freshman Caleb Williams that year, and then ends up transferring to South Carolina. Moving on to the number 3 best example, it has to be Kenny Hill. After Johnny Manziel left Texas A&M, was a first-round pick by the Browns, Kenny Hill comes in, and in 2014, I mean, his stats are not terrible looking at them, 23 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, but look at the start that he had. At South Carolina, 44 of 60, 5'11", 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. He goes for 4 touchdowns, no interceptions against Lamar, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions against Rice. The definition of a September Heisman. He loses 3 straight games and just, completely tails off there towards the end of the season. Kenny Hill, one of the better examples on this list. Moving on to number 2, it's got to be Leonard Fournette, the former number 1 overall recruit. Going into his sophomore year, absolute beast. He finished with 22 rushing touchdowns, but Leonard Fournette, you look at that start, 159 rushing yards. Look at the touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, 2 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, over 200 yards. I remember that game at Syracuse. Oh, that game, everybody thought Leonard Fournette was going to win the Heisman, and then the Alabama game completely derails it. 19 carries for 31 yards. LSU was completely one-dimensional. They couldn't pass the ball, and Alabama was stacking the box, and that was the Derrick Henry versus Leonard Fournette game. Leonard Fournette was the heavy leader going into that game in terms of the Heisman, and it ended up costing him the award. That's another good example. And then number 1, the September Heisman GOAT. It's got to be Geno Smith. Oh my goodness. West Virginia, going to the Big 12, his senior season. He did have a really good season, 42 touchdowns, just 6 interceptions, but the start, look at the completion percentage. 32 of 36, 4 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. 34 of 39, 400 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. the 8-touchdown game against Baylor where he went 45 of 51 for 656 yards. Let's play some defense, folks. My goodness. And then even at Texas, getting a win, going for 4 passing touchdowns, no interceptions, and then he completely tails off. They end up losing like 6 straight games, and he's not even relevant at the end of the year in terms of the Heisman. But that's got to be the best example of a September Heisman, and then just completely tailing off after. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.